This will be a fun series, and we're going to talk all about Meshtastic over the next several episodes at least. We're going to build all these different Meshtastic devices as you figure out what Meshtastic is and if it's going to be something that you might be interested in, and what is the point of Meshtastic. I'm going to do this in a unique way that may resonate with you and it may not. There's different people and there's different ways of learning. But I think we should have a fun time as we tear apart all these different Meshtastic devices and rebuild them so we could see what's inside, and you're even going to get to choose if building or buying is right for you. With that, we're going to get started today with the Spec 5 Trekker that you see on the table. The Spec 5 Trekker is $129 and you can purchase it through Spec 5's website. I'm not affiliated. Or you can go online and you can buy your own case through Spec 5 and it would be $29.95, and you could build your own by sourcing out your own parts. At the surface of it all, the thing that you're going to need for Meshtastic is some sort of Meshtastic device. In the description, I'll post a link to a GitHub page which shows you all the Meshtastic devices, what kind of chipsets they're running, if they have Wi-Fi, if they have GPS, and much, much more. Today, we're going to use the T-Beam from Lilygo, which does contain GPS and it does contain Bluetooth as well. The reason we're going to choose the Lilygo for our Meshtastic node is because it fits into the Spec 5, which I'm replacing this one. The first Lilygo had an SMA connector issue, which should be no fault of Spec 5. So when you're getting started into Meshtastic, you might be thinking like, well, there's so many devices out there. What do I buy? And that's a great question. What I'm starting to recognize myself is there's different devices for different use cases. Okay, so maybe somebody wants a keyboard. Maybe the Lilygo T-Beam isn't the one for you, but maybe something like the T-Deck is. And in the description below, I'll post a GitHub link which shows all the different types of Meshtastic devices available and some of their pros and cons, or rather what chipsets they have, if they have GPS already installed on them, like this T-Beam here, and how they connect. Of course, is it an SMA or is it something you press down and you have your own cable? A great list. It's very comprehensive. Today, we could take a look at the T-Beam, which we're going to install in this case specifically made for the T-Beam. It's important to know, too, though, that you could find any case on something like printables.com or thingiverse.com, and you can print your own if you have a 3D printer or access to one. Now, this one takes an 18650 battery, and the Spec 5 guys use the Samsung 18650-25R battery. And the only thing that you really need to caution yourself on about when plugging it in is that you have an SMA connector in here and that you put it on the correct side. So you don't want to put your negative on the positive. You'll cause damage. The Spec 5 case that we're dealing with today comes in three major parts. You have the back cover, the front plate, and the center bezel, which you see here in black. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take three buttons that also come with the whole setup, and we're going to put the buttons into the case. They're only going to go one way, as you can see here. The buttons will sit flush with the bezel. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to insert our T-Beam. It's only going to go one way. And I say that because of this little groove here for the SMA port. Now that we have our buttons in and they appear to be in OK, they appear to press OK, what we'll do is we're going to set our T-Beam and the bezel onto the back case. The reason we're going to do that, if we try to set the case on the ground, it's going to push the board up and we're not going to be able to put the four screws in that we're going to put in next. These four screws. So let's do that. And one of the things that I've always learned or been taught is when you put screws in, you're going to go diagonal. So put this one in, don't screw it down all the way, go diagonal, put this one in, don't screw it down all the way, followed by this one, and then tighten them all up once everything's in. And as you can see, I put those four screws in, everything is tightened down, and the buttons seem to press OK. We don't have a battery in yet, and that's a good thing. Because before we put the battery in, we want to make sure that we have an SMA antenna on the actual radio itself. By default and by stock, if you purchase a Lilygo or if you purchase a Spec 5, it'll come with an antenna that looks like this. I've went ahead and I've upgraded to a 3 dBi antenna, and this does help out just a little bit in my experience. And now that that's in, let's go ahead and put in our battery. Now this is very simple. Our battery is only going to go in one way. It can go in two ways, but one of the ways will really harm the radio itself or the node itself. So there's a plus sign over on the left-hand side, the way I'm looking at it. And on these 18650 batteries, well, this is the positive side. You might see a little kind of like a recessed nipple, if you will, and that's going to be the positive side. A side that's flat like this is the negative of an 18650 battery. And as I mentioned, Spec 5 uses the 18650 25R battery, which you see here. If you're going to buy your own 18650 battery, I suggest you do the research because you guessed it, people, even on Amazon, will exaggerate the truth on what a battery's capacity is. So we got the positive, and we're just going to put this in. Now, when I flip this over, we're going to see that there's a little screen on here, and it shows us a few things. It shows us our firmware number. Now, I've already programmed this, so that's why my firmware is up to date. However, yours might say something like 2.3, and what I'm starting to see is a lot of the firmware that comes stock with these devices is an older firmware 2.3. Next, before we even put everything else together, we're going to update the firmware on the computer. To update the firmware on the computer, we're going to need to find a micro USB cable because the T-Beam comes with a micro USB. The T-Beam Supreme, or the Taco Bell Supreme as I call it, does come with a USB-C, but it will not fit this case as I recall. Next up, we're going to do something awesome. We're going to plug in our T-Beam as we go over to flasher.meshtastic.org, which I'll link below. And as we plug in our T-Beam to the USB or micro USB, we should hear Windows acknowledging that it's plugged in. And that's great, it is. Now, all we really have to do, provided our drivers are installed, is click the little rocket icon here, and it should automatically detect our device after we select a communication port. So as we click that, this little pop-up occurs and you see, hey, USB single serial COM 17. Your COM port will be different. Let's go ahead and select it and click connect. And look at that, it pops up Lilygo T-Beam. It's smart enough to know what it is. And as I mentioned, having the upgraded firmware is very important because certain things will change which might affect the reliability of your device or even how it uses security keys. Today, we're going to go ahead and upgrade to the most stable version, which is 2.5.20.4C, whatever that says. And at this point, we're going to click the flash button. After we click flash, we get a list of known issues, and we're going to click continue. And all we're going to do here is we're going to upgrade it. I'm going to do a full erase and install, and I'm going to click erase flash and install, which you should be able to see down here. And let's just go ahead and do it now. We're going to see this screen go crazy. It's going to say it's deleting things. And the most important thing at this point while it's writing is to not touch anything and let it do its thing. Eventually, it'll get to a screen that says leaving. And that's when I'll see you back here in just a moment. When we get to this point where it shows leaving and nothing's happening, that means everything has been completed. So what I like to do is I like to unplug my T Supreme or my Meshtastic device. And at this point, I'm going to close out of all of my Chrome windows and reopen them. The next step we're going to do is we're going to set up our client, or we're going to configure our Meshtastic device slightly. Now, I've already done some of these steps to make it a little bit easier to follow. However, the first thing we want to do is when we get to client.meshtastic.org, we're going to click new connection, and it's going to ask us how we want to connect to our LoRa device or our Meshtastic device. Since we're plugged in with our USB, we're going to click serial, and you probably won't see this. You're going to click on new device. And when you do that, you're going to find that same COM port we used to flash the firmware, and you're going to connect to that. All of a sudden, here it is. You see there was two devices for me, 1 and 0, but there's only going to be one for you. You select it and it brings you into here. Now, this is our whole Meshtastic client. From here, we could send messages out to the world and let them hear us directly without cell phone communications. However, before we do that, we need to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page, the same frequencies, and that we're all operating the same way so we could all hear each other. And for us to do that, first thing we want to do is we want to give ourselves a unique name. There's an edit button up here. And as you can see, I have a naming convention that I've started. I am naming all my nodes after the 1990 legends, the American Gladiators. And this allows me to know that these are my nodes, and it makes it easier for other people to know, oh, those are probably his nodes, you know? And with that, I have a long name as Laser, and a short name could only be 4 characters. Now, one of the cool things about this is you could use ASCII codes to have a unique emoji as your short name, like the Earth, for example, or a piece of pizza. But today I'm just going to leave it as LASR, and I'm going to click Save. Next up, we're going to go over to the Config tab, and when we click on Config, there's just a few things we need to do. Number one, it's kind of important for us to go to Role right here, and under Role, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to select the proper role for this Meshtastic node. There's some really cool stuff in here, like having lost and found and a tracker. However, if this is your first node, you're probably just going to want to select Client, and we're going to leave it at that for right now. I will link below a tutorial or a guide that shows all about the different role types, and one or the other might be better for you. So let's go ahead now, and we're going to click on the LoRa tab. And this is all very basic just to make sure that we're getting things at least configured somewhat correctly. We're going to go to the region. You can see it's on set, and there's all these different regions we could select. Let's select the US. And our hop limit is always recommended to leave it at 3, but I think this can go up to about 7. Here's the big one too, frequency slot. We're going to change this over to 20. Now that we have that to 20, there's not too much else we need to change in this section. So we're going to go ahead and, well, let's click on Bluetooth. There's a couple things here that you might want to change. My Bluetooth is enabled, and that's really good because I'm going to use my phone to connect to the LoRa device, and I don't need a cell phone network to use Bluetooth. And what I'm going to do then is I could send messages through the Meshtastic phone app, which I'll show you at a later date. But I just wanted to make sure that Bluetooth was enabled and the pairing mode was set to random pin. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to click the little save icon that's in the upper right-hand side of the screen, like you see right here. And once I click save, we'll see the little pinwheel, and then it should say saving has been, or configuration has been saved. Now, very good. Let's go ahead and reboot our device. It'll reboot on its own, but I've always found that unplugging the USB and then plugging it back in seems to kind of help whatever kind of weird hiccups you might sometimes experience with the Meshtastic hardware and the client itself. Okay, we are now over at client.meshtastic.org. Yet again, I now have the USB restarted. The Lilygo has been restarted. I'm going to click on new connection. And if I click on serial, there it is. That same device that we just added a moment ago. I'm going to click on it. And we can see that it has my changes of laser and laser. And all I'm going to really do at this point is I want to click on nodes. And I want to see if any nodes have been found yet. I think that it's a very important, yep, there it is, dudes G2. So I know that I'm receiving nodes, and I could, let's see if I click on this node right here and I click on dudes G2 like you see here, I can click trace route. And what this is going to do, it's going to try to make sure that we've had this connection established, that he hears me and he could respond back to me, and I'll know that everything's working with the radio itself. And it says on the bottom of the screen, sending trace route, please wait. Once it actually comes back, we see the trace route details that I have a really good signal to dudes G2, which makes a lot of sense because of where I'm at in relation to the G2. Let's go back to the desk and finish the build. All right, this next part is going to be super easy. We're going to finish installing our case, and then we're going to talk about the buttons. But we can see that on the front of the unit, it has some information, long fast. And long fast is automatically installed when you update the firmware. Long fast is like a default unsecured, unencrypted channel. It's like a general chat room, if you will. Of course, at a later date, we can go in and we can take a look at how to add secure channels and security 256-bit encryption keys. But for right now, it shows that we're on long fast, and it shows that we have no satellites acquired. It's probably because we're indoors at the moment. We'll let that sit and we'll check before the episode's over. As we take a look here on the case, the back case can only go onto the bezel one way. If we try to go a different way, none of the screw holes will line up. So here we go. We have the back case, and we're going to put the front case or front plate on as well, which also is only going to be able to go one way. One of the observations I made with this antenna in particular is it doesn't necessarily sit okay with the antenna on there. So I took just like one small turn and I adjusted it so that everything should fit and line up okay. Now I'm just going to go ahead and place these screws through each of the 4 holes, making sure everything gets lined up okay. And finally, all we're going to do is we're going to put or screw the nuts into the actual bolts or screws that we just placed into the case. It's going to connect everything together and keep it nice and secure. All right, so I did end up putting the stock or factory antenna back on, which I believe is not as good as something like this antenna right here. The reason I did so, though, is it's a little too thick of an antenna, or the diameter is a little bit wide, and it just didn't fit right into this case. Of course, in the future, I could always go find another case on Thingiverse or printables. Heck, I could design my own case and have it so that this would fit as I wish it to fit. Let's take a look here. There's a couple of different things that we could do. Number one, if we tap the power button, nothing really happens. If we hold down the power button for about 4 seconds or so, we should see this thing go black and it will basically shut off like you saw there. Now, you would think that, hey, maybe if we hold down the power button for just a second, it will turn back on. That's because it will turn back on. And, you know, obviously having it powered off is good for power consumption. After all, a battery only lasts so long. And with the battery only lasting so long, if you have it off completely, it really does help for you to essentially save and conserve your battery. However, maybe you didn't want to shut it off and you just needed to reset it. Something was not working correctly or was a little bit funky. Just tap the reset button or the RST button on the right-hand side and you'll see it reboot. Now, realistically, the only other thing we really are going to focus on at this point is the IO38 button, which if we tap on it, it will basically allow us to go through the different screens that are on this device. So for example, right now we have 4.12 volts left, 99% battery. We're on channel long fast, and we have no GPS log. My best guess is that GPS pin that was on there isn't fully pressed in. I'll check that in just a moment. If I continue to go on, I see all the stations that I've heard. So I heard Dude's G2 100 seconds ago, and he had a perfect signal. And we can continue on here. If I hold down the IO38 button, nothing happens. So now we basically have a good idea of how this device functions. And the other thing that was included with this, as this was fully assembled when I originally got it, was a carabiner. And as soon as I can find that, I'll put it on there. I took it outside for just a moment, and as you could see here, it did acquire 5 satellites. So everything's good there. I did find the carabiner. And one other thing I wanted to point out, you know, there's this little stand that's here that's held together by a magnet on each side. And the stand just allows you to hold your case together. And of course, I found my carabiner so I could clip this onto a backpack or something like that. Have a great one.